All right, then let's get started. Welcome, welcome, welcome to our November webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusion, where our team works to deconstruct diversity concepts, theories, and methodologies. And we try to unpack information in a way that's easily digestible and still profoundly impactful. First, if you haven't been on one of our webinars before, let me introduce myself. I am Darylyn Zenobia Swift. Many call me Dee, or they call me Dee Z, and I am the Chief Empowerment Officer for Premier Organizational Designs. And we are an organizational development firm, and we focus on people. So our areas of expertise are leadership development, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and developing cultures where there's a sense of empowerment and belonging. If you'd like to follow me on IG, you can find me at d.zenobia Swift, the empowerment mindset. But let's get started and let's talk about. Today, we're discussing building a framework of allyship and sponsorship. And one of the reasons this is important for us to talk about it is because the practice of emphasizing inclusion and human rights by members of an in-group to advance the interests of an oppressed or marginalized out-group, that's allyship. It's a critical component of fighting against the Isnt and the isms that marginalized and oppressed people experience every day. And then when you couple that with having a company that has interconnected relationships that are based on positive reinforcement, support, and advocacy, then a cultural change of inclusion and belonging, it makes an impact on people individually and as an organization. So now I'm talking about sponsorship. And many people talk about allyship and sponsorship, sometimes interchangeably, but they're different. And we're going to talk about those differences today. Absolutely. So I personally believe that each of these roles and relationships are instrumental in creating a strong, inclusive culture of both in both our communities and in our professional work. But I want to jump into it from the perspectives of my two colleagues that I have with me today. They are both diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI practitioners and executive leadership practitioners. And they both have strong thoughts and opinions about allyship and sponsorship. So I wanted to include them in on this discussion or this conversation. But before we jump in, I'd like each of you to introduce yourself, because I don't want to do a disservice to the totality of your background and your experience and just the awesomeness of who each of you are. So please introduce yourself, and let's start with Janine, and then immediately Dr. Vic Baker, if you'll take on and give us your introduction. If you can both tell us your name, about your background, and your association with DEI.
Well, hello, and Darylyn, thank you so much for having me on the show today. I feel very honored to be in the presence of all this intellectual knowledge with Dr. Baker and with you and everybody who's dialing in. And so because I want to get into the meat of why we're here, I'm going to be really brief with my introduction. I am Jeannine Brown. I am the founder and managing director of Everyday Lead. We are a talent development and diversity, equity, inclusion consultancy based in Atlanta. We do work all over the world, and really excited about the work and the opportunity we have to work with companies to help them build cultures of belonging where everyone can thrive. And we do that in a variety of different ways with diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, where we actually sit down with companies and their executives and design what that strategy is with the end in mind, right? What do we want that company to look like and the experiences we want employees to have every day, even 10, 15, 20, 100 years from today. We do that also with training and development, as well as with executive and leadership coaching. So we believe that DE&I should be in the DNA of an organization. And I have some very controversial, maybe not necessarily controversial, but maybe different ideas around allyship. So I'm really excited to share that with you and everyone who is attending. And I just want to thank everybody for dialing in and spending this time with us today.
Oh, Janine, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I feel honored to be amongst these all-stars today. And the fact that you even asked me, I feel so privileged at this moment. and I won't take too much of your time. I'm Dr. Vic Baker. I've been a corporate exec for a number of years. I've been in the utility and energy industry for over 25 years as an engineer and corporate exec, and just recently received my doctorate degree in organization and development about a year ago. And with that said, started a company called Equitify.us. So Equitify really embodies the idea of organizational structure as a sustainable tool for enriching diversity, equity, and inclusion in a whole work ecosystem, right? And so, as Janine mentioned, the end result of this is a diverse group of employees and managers and executives and board members who are all equipped with the acumen and the tools and the goals and systems that ensure organization's mission is successful, both profitable, maximizing performance, and we increase a tailored strategy that encompasses pedagogy and workshops and coaching and group facilitation and keynote speaking. Our intent is to be unapologetic about identifying and countering systematic oppression. That is what we stand for, and that is what we do. And so I'm excited to work with a few major organizations throughout the United States here. I haven't gotten worldwide yet, but I plan on going to France because I know someone in France who's going to help me expand to France. But yes, I'm looking forward to meeting you guys and having this robust discussion. And like Janine, I have some passion. You might see it today. Yeah, it's going to come out, I'm sure. But let's have that. Let's have that passion. Let's have that discussion.
Absolutely.
Let's get into it.
Let's get into it. And the one word you said, Vic, that I think the three of us share is unapologetic. We are unapologetic about advancing the work of DEI and focusing on equity and creating cultures of inclusion and a sense of belonging. So thanks to both of you. And we also have two technical members with us today. Carla Stafford, she's going to be managing the chat box. We like for there to be a party in the chat box. So whatever you're thinking, any questions you have, go ahead, type it into the chat box. And Carla's going to be paying attention to that and alerting us to when we need to interject something that is said, or she's going to be taking questions that we'll have time at the end for question and answer. So we'll be able to do that, put information in the chat box. And then we have Megan Sims, who is our technical genius that's with us today. So let's jump right in. And for those of you on the webinar, take notes because again, we're going to have question and answer later. But for today, our goals are to educate everyone on what it means and the importance of both allyship and sponsorship. We're going to understand the connection between those two and understand how they impact us at work. So Dr. Baker, let's start with you. What does allyship look like on a personal level and community level? And why do you think allies are so important in our atmosphere and at work?
Man, what a great question to start this off. But in order to do that, we have to first start with identifying and defining what ally means. It's important that we do that so we can have a basis of where we're going to go from here, because my definition of ally may be different than everyone else's. So let's make, the Webster's dictionary. If we get online right now and look at Webster's, it has a really simple definition, and it means to join with another person or group in order to give or get their support. That's what ally means. We're talking in terms today about oppression and allyship as relation to oppression. And so when we define ally in terms of oppression, I take from some great authors, both Jamie Washington and Nancy Evans, way back when, who wrote some great stuff in 1991 about allyship. And they define it as a member of the dominant group, a majority group who works to end oppression in their personal and professional life through the support of and the advocacy with and for the oppressed population. So they start off with this definition with who can and cannot be an ally, right? So we start off right there. And an ally, for me, has to be a member of the dominant majority group, first and foremost.
Right.
It is their power that is sustaining the change that's going to come. The power that sustains change is going to come from the dominant group no matter what. So despite all the protests we have, despite the employment discrimination complaints, despite the blatant disregard for humanity that exists, despite how we can come together collectively as a group, the change comes when somebody of power puts their name on a piece of paper and signs it into existence at the very end of the day, all right? And then the second part of that is, what does that support look like? There's an entire progression to becoming an ally, in my opinion. First and foremost, we got to recognize what that power and privilege, one has to recognize the power and privilege that they receive. They have to accept that privilege and those experiences that come with it. In order for somebody to be an ally, if they don't understand their privilege, how can they possibly understand how they can leverage that privilege and that power and those experiences to really move the needle in disintegration? And we call that disintegration stage, right? And then that piece is, the next piece, of course, is motivation, the moral reasoning. And there's 3 levels of that. I won't get into that because that can be very academic, but I'm gonna throw these terms at you: pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Pre-conventional, care for self. What's in it for me? I've had a lot of success in developing diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, including supplier diversity in organizations, because I've applied diversity goals to economic benefits. So they're bonuses. Once you do that, you see the numbers change. However, are people really motivated to do that? Their only motivation is their motivation, right? Mm-hmm. I call that pre-conventional. It works, there's a place, but understand where that is. That doesn't mean you're an ally just because you're meeting a goal to help your pocketbooks work. Right. Then you got convention and care for others. And I call that kind of, you don't want to be part of that shame group. So I want to be part of the popular group. So, hey, my friends over there saying Black Lives Matter. So, okay, Black Lives Matter. I'm gonna choose a side, right? I'm not going to do the Blue Lives Matter. I'm going to do the Black Lives, you know? I just don't want to be shamed. And then you have the post-conventional, which I think is where allies really lie. And that's the impact on others. That's the acts of justice. That's an active role, a premium active role to ensure that all people are treated equitably. And that comes from understanding the right thing to do. So, I mean, all those things, when we talk about defining what an ally and why it's important, ally is not just a support group. Mm-hmm. These are people who advocate through their personal, professional, spiritual life for the oppressed. They advocate. They're confronting inappropriate behavior, even when it isn't popular, or it may even harm them professionally and personally. Right. Okay. That's what an ally looks like. And in order for you to be that kind of advocate, you have to, and be a great ally, you have to continuously do these 4 things. You have to continuously be aware. You have to continuously improve your knowledge, your skill, and you have to continuously take action. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I will leave with this, and I will end with this little monologue here, and that is, don't self-proclaim yourself as an ally. I say this to my leadership teams all the time. You're not a leader if no one is following you. Just because people work for you doesn't make you a leader, makes you a boss. Right. You're not an ally just because you say you're an ally, because you wrote a piece of paper and said, hey, here you go. No, that actually, that proclamation of ally is going to come from your oppressed group. It is like the black card. I mean, I know we all heard of that black card. Yes. Right. It's our group, it's the oppressed group that's going to say, hey, we love what you're doing. And there are great examples. We'll talk about some of those examples later on in this, but there's some great examples of allies that exist today that it's worth reading and looking into, because people actually are doing the work. And just because you have somebody in your company that says, hey, oppression is bad, does not make them an ally. Right. There needs to be some action taken. Okay.
Absolutely. So I always say that being an ally, it's a verb, because there has to be action that's taken. And then the other piece to that, I like what you said when you say, you can't just say I'm an ally and that's it. Like the action that's attached to it, even when it's uncomfortable for you, is what's important. Man. So, yeah, exactly. So Janine, I know you have a unique perspective on allies, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But I'll ask you the same question when it comes to sponsors. What does sponsorship look like on a personal or organizational level? And why do you think sponsors are so important?
So I love sponsors. I've been the recipient of sponsorship throughout my career, even before I knew what was happening. And so I think one of the reasons sponsorship is so important, and I'm gonna start with the end in mind, is because it is the folks on the inside constantly opening the door, is how I look at that. They put their social capital on the line for the advancement of any other, right? So anyone there. I think there's some bias built into sponsorship, and we'll get into that. And so I think a sponsor is someone who recognizes that if we look at it from the lens of a talent pipeline within a corporate or a business organization, that within that talent pipeline, that it narrows as it moves forward or moves up, and then the narrowing disqualifies. And so they actually acknowledge and they see that there's opportunity. One, they see that there's a bottleneck, right? That there's a narrowing that is happening in the upward trajectory of the workforce, and that people who are very valuable to that organization are being overlooked, right? So it could be anyone who is not white, heterosexual, cisgender, and identifies as male in a lot of organizations in the US and even maybe throughout the world. And so kind of almost with more specificity than what Dr. Baker was sharing, if we say that majority group is primarily cisgender, heterosexual, white men, or someone that identifies as male, they are, or others are, pulling those people who are being trapped, I would say, sometimes in the bottleneck of upward trajectory. And those sponsors are the ones who are ringing the alarms, actively putting their social capital out, speaking for, on behalf of, and in absence of those individuals who they specifically think will continue to be valuable in their organizations as they move up and move forward. So they are actively widening that talent pipeline if we look at it from a perspective of talent.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So with that said, you know, the concept of privilege came up earlier, and I saw a message in the chat box about we all have some type of privilege.
We all have it.
We all have some type of privilege, but specifically, what privileges, and this is to Dr. Baker, what privileges do you think people are afforded because they act as an ally, or they self-proclaim, or they are an ally? And I know you also connect the influence of the Quakers with being an ally. So can you also share with us that interesting historical reference?
So we go back to motivation. And so when we talk about motivation, the pre-conventional, conventional, and the post-conventional, that really is a migration, a mental migration, psychological migration that someone has to go through. And when it comes to that post-conventional, when we think about the impact on others, the reward is about doing the right thing. And so when we talk about the Quakers and what they stood for and how they participated in the abolitionist society when we're going through these, as we're experiencing slavery and coming out of slavery, and how they helped with the Underground Railroad, they were about doing the right thing. Their motivation was the Christian motivation of everyone on this earth are God's children, and they should be treated fairly, and no one should be treated unequally, right? That was their motivation. So whatever they needed to do to get to that basis is what they did. So when we ask what that privilege is, their privilege is knowing that they're doing the right thing for the right reason. When we talk about the conventional and pre-conventional, some of that is caring for self, and that's not really an ally. That's really in not being shamed. And being an abolitionist alone is not make you an ally. But they did an extra and did the action. So they're part of their action, part of the Quakers And as we relate even to this day, part of the people who actually do the work and reflection of what Janine said about sponsorship, great for us to have sponsors who can make available opportunities that that elevate us. But when we're being elevated and we're still getting paid 70 cents on the dollar and our Black women are getting paid 50 cents on the dollar, where's the equitability in that, right? So, and who's sitting in that room? The same person who elevated Janine, who elevated that person, they're sitting in a room and they absolutely know that there's a discrepancy in the amount of opportunity. They know that there's a discrepancy in the pay range and the wage gap, and they choose not to do anything about it.
That is not an ally, and that is not a sponsor.
Right. And so we have to consider what exactly that is when we ask about the motivation and the privilege that comes out of this. I do feel that allies get their privilege out of doing the right thing and making sure that they, again, we use the word unapologetic, are unapologetic about doing the right thing at all times and given the opportunity and recognizing that they have the ability to do that.
Yeah. So I think, Dr. Baker, I love what you said, and I'm glad you gave that specific example about pay inequity. And I think whenever we speak up in any form, regardless of what the title is, right? Supporter, ally, sponsor, cheerleader, whatever that is, I think it has to be a change-making proclamation, right? We're going to promote this person and we're going to ensure that they are paid equitably based on the work they do and everyone else that sits at this table.
Right.
And so I think when I'm working with our clients, I am very clear that our work, if we're designing a sponsorship program, if we're designing an allyship training, that it hits all of those points. Like, what are you working toward? Right? Because no matter who is in the position of ally or being supported, that all the things that are important for success are there. So even as a cisgender, heterosexual female woman that I am, when the opportunity presents itself to support, to sponsor, or to provide allyship to someone who is not, I have to understand what their needs and what their needs are. So if there is a homosexual, lesbian, queer, all the words, right? Whatever they are that are different than me, then I still have to understand what her or his concerns or their concerns are so that I can really sit in that position of allyship and sponsorship. And so I think you hit that really well. And I just wanted to expand on that because, as we said, we all have privilege in some way. And most of us who identify as cisgender, heterosexual, we fall into a huge category.
We do. We absolutely, I agree with completely, Janine. We have our own privilege. And just because we may be African-American, maybe cisgender, African-American, I'm a cisgender African-American male, I have a privilege with regards to being an ally to our LGBTQ community. Especially here in the
look at me, amen. I almost amened you.
Right? So I have a privilege. I have the ability. I have a privilege that they don't. That they. Excuse me for my lack of use of correct pronouns throughout this whole message. And if I don't use it, don't take it personally. The correct pronoun as we go through this. But what I really want to get across is I have a privilege to other disintegrated or disenfranchised communities. And I need to understand that privilege as well in a person of power, whatever power and privilege I have. It may not be the power and privilege somebody else's has, but I have some. Let me recognize it. Let me use it for the good. Let me do right for those people. Let me speak up on behalf of them. And let's make sure that we don't have that terrible language that goes on in the corporate boardrooms. Let me make sure that we don't chastise or remove opportunity from people just because they're different than us. And I need to be able to speak up in those rooms. And I choose to do that. Even at my own demise, I choose to do that. But it's the right thing to do. at the
You
very
hit
end.
something really good. And this is where I had, and Daryl, I'm sorry if we didn't hijack the Q&A.
No, this is great. No,
Dr. Baker done
this is
opened the
great
door.
conversation.
Yeah.
So,
Go for it.
and that's the thing right there, right? Even to my own demise, how
Mhm.
many of us are willing to put ourselves out there to the point that backlash might fall on us? And this is where I feel most challenged with allyship, because I've seen it under attack, and I've seen our white brothers and sisters roll back
Yep.
because they don't want to be attacked. They don't want to end up on that side. And I understand that. I clearly understand it. And this is why I lean more into sponsorship than allyship, because when it gets uncomfortable, how willing are you to really put yourself out there? And several years ago, and it's still happening now, we're going to see it even more. It's actually starting to resurface. There was a significant amount of backlash coming upon white women back in 2017, 2018 time period, because there was all of this conversation. I think some of it came out of Hollywood's Me Too movement.
Me too.
But right. And so that form of the Me Too movement, I want to be really clear about that. But there was this backlash, and the voices started to silence, because when we, and I understand that, and I do understand it, I empathize with it, but I think that's where I start to really feel uncertain about allyship and its ability to really thrive, because when it becomes uncomfortable, are you willing to stay and stand and continue to fight for what you believe, right? Both. And I think, Dr. Baker, you said socially and professionally is being an ally. So I think that's the challenge. And I think that can happen for anybody. You don't have to be white to feel like, okay, I'm going, I want to get out of the line of fire because of how because of my voice and advocating for people who are different than me and seeing the difference. And I'm going to close this part of this statement with this. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing small groups with a client. We were doing these small working groups talking about their potential sponsorship program. This particular group had difference, but it did not have any person of color. So there were heterosexual, there were LGBTQ, there were men, and there were women, people who identified as male and female. But there were no people of color. We got to a question talking about sponsorship, and one brave young man, Soul, he spoke up and he said, as it pertains to this question, I haven't been affected by this, but I have several colleagues who are Black, Hispanic, and Latino, and I've heard them share and express their concerns, their hurt, their just, all the words he started to use to speak up on their behalf. That call got really quiet after that.
It got quiet, I'm sure.
He put himself out there. I commended him. I commended him. I joined in to celebrate his allyship and his sponsorship and him putting his social capital out there. One, because I wanted to help protect him, because I didn't know what was going to happen when he got off that call. Right. But that is what we want to see. And I think if we do that, if we all recognize our privilege and we all are out speaking on behalf of others, and let's take it back into the corporations, right? In these companies, we end up creating a culture of allyship. Man, right? It actually just starts to blossom on its own. And then we start creating these conversations and this culture of belonging, because that's what allyship is supposed to produce.
Yeah.
Right. Now, let me ask a quick question or tell you a story and then ask a question. So it sounds like a similar story we had on a webinar several months ago. And the young lady that was on, she has her PhD in something in the educational field. So she's Dr. whomever. And she was just talking about how some of the people sitting in the room making decisions about her don't even have the level of credentials that she has, but they're making decisions about whether or not she's qualified to be able to handle certain tasks or to have a certain role. And one person in the room, who happened to be a white male, called it out. He said, why are we making decisions about a person who has more credentials than we have? Like, how the absurdness of that. how can we convene a group of people that haven't been out there doing the actual work and we're making decisions about it? However, when it came to someone else of a different identity that looked more like them, that process didn't happen.
Come on.
So it was felt as though, and he called it out, like we're making her go through additional steps of proving herself before we give her an opportunity. And she's already proven herself through her work and through her education. So when I think about that, and this, Jeannine, you could talk to us about your unique perspective on allyship versus sponsorship. Which is that? Is that allyship, or is that sponsorship, or is that a combination of both?
I think that's a mix of both, one, but I also think it's a high level of awareness, right?
Man.
Bias was that there was bias in the system. And so I think if we understand what we're looking for, we can all be those things, right? We can be the detectives of bias, right? Which might root us in being a little bit more.
Let me write that down.
I'm writing it down too.
The detective of bias. Okay.
Detective of bias.
Yeah, then we identify those things, and then that probably ends up creating more allyship for us, creating more sponsorship in our organizations, because it can't just be a small group. You know, Dr. Baker mentioned this. It can't just be one small group that's trying to change everything for the larger group. And I think organizations and companies, HR leaders, talent development leaders, they really need to be having these conversations and teaching people how to create belonging for everyone by doing this, by identifying bias in every area of the organization, so that we're all having these same conversations. I've been in groups around the table with women at all 8 stages in the organization. And when we start talking about bringing in more women leaders, even they fall into the bias trap of talking about making sure he's qualified. And I always have to ask, well, do you practice hiring unqualified people at this company? Because if you do, I know some, right?
Right.
I know some people that y'all paying unqualified people. Let's bring them on in here.
Right.
You know, and I think what we do it. We've done it as Black people. We want to make sure that they're the best of the best of the best. Right. But instead, we need to create parameters that we measure everyone by. We need to pay people what they're owed, like, you know, the great philosopher and equity champion herself, Rihanna. And what you owe. You know, pay people, and so that they can one, feel a sense of dignity in the workplace.
Man, you've opened up so many opportunities for us to go in so many avenues here. We're going to try to stay in this, but I have to comment on that. I have to comment on the fact that when you talk about a combination of sponsorship and allyship in this entire realm, and Janine, when you talk about HR and being in a position of influence, we have to use the word accountability here. And how are we holding each other accountable? So how are the leaders in these organizations holding each other accountable? Most of you guys have been in these rooms, and you know that you're the most qualified, the most educated, the most qualified in the room. You've been there. There's not a job I haven't had where I walked in the room and had people think that the only reason I'm there is because it was a diversity hire.
Right.
I'm a diversity hire, not because I'm the best person for that. I've had people, I've sat in a room and been their boss and they hadn't known, and people have asked me, why are you here? And when I started offering information, say, what are your qualifications? Well, ask me right then and there what my qualifications are. And I have, and I felt obligated to say what my qualifications, and I have the obligation to say, and I'm your boss, and we're not going to do that anymore, right? So I'm here because I qualify to do this work, and we're going to do it together. We're going to work together. But you're right, in the room together, we often have to justify our education, our experience, and we're most of the time more experienced and more educated than everyone else in the room. In addition to that, as we continue to move up the ladder, the qualifications for that next level seemingly changes as we get more education.
Right.
But the people who are already at that level don't have the qualifications that you're asking me to get while you're there. I don't understand that.
Help me understand that.
Help
Yeah,
me
it's
understand that.
interesting. Yeah, because people of color have done all the things, right? We got the, it was always something. And I think you're right.
Yeah.
The bar continues to move.
It continues to move,
Yeah.
Janine.
And in
Yes.
2018, Ferry did a study on executives, and it uncovered all the things that they were faced with in the workplace. And it was really eye-opening. It was things that I kind of knew, but when you see that someone is an EVP or they're the CFO and they are sharing in a blind study their hearts around what they deal with in the workplace, and you feel like, wow, it never ends.
It doesn't.
Right.
And these people are making $500,000, $1 million. Let's talk about salary, right?
Right.
They're making $1 million in some of these organizations
Right.
a year, but they still are faced with these sorts of, the things that you were just saying, Dr. Baker, the bias.
And can we touch on placation? Can we touch on the fact that as we come out of this 2020, this uprising, this vision and this touch point on African Americans specifically in their community and their involvement and the oppression that we face, and the hiring of diversity, equity, and inclusion directors and vice presidents, and putting them into, I call them placation, putting them into a position of title, but not influence.
Right. Yeah. Just to say they have the numbers, or look what we've done. We have a diversity hire.
Right. So we have a diversity hire. We give them a nice title, but they're still not in the boardroom being able to make decisions, nor are they integrated into the working departments to really move the needle. So who's listening to them, and what power do they exude throughout the organization to actually increase these numbers? So while I put the nice, beautiful face, and don't get me wrong, if you got the job, take the job. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
If you're offered the job, absolutely take the job, because that's more money, more for your family. And we talk about generational wealth on another end. But the reality is, I love seeing them on LinkedIn, and they come in, boom, boom, boom. Somebody's hired as this, vice president of HR. Somebody's hired as the vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion at all these Fortune 500 companies. Wonderful that you guys got the job, but actually, can you and do you have the influence and the power to make a difference in that company, or is it just a title?
Or is it just a title?
Whenever I take on a new client, I ask the client this question when they're talking about they have a lack of diversity and we want to increase diversity. I ask them, is this a social movement? Is this a social resource group that you're trying to put together? Or is this a movement that you're trying to make into the right direction where we can increase performance as well and bottom line profit? Because if it's just a social and you just want to do it because you want to look good and you're about to do this bid and you want to be able to show on your bid package that you have this program, I'm not for you, right?
I say that too. I'm not a check the box person.
I'm not the check the box, right? Darylyn, we spoke about that. We're not check the box.
Did.
We want a movement. We want you to actually be ingrained in this and actually do something. So we have to talk about placation as well. Not that this is the right forum. Maybe this is for another time, but when we talk about sponsorship and just moving somebody into a higher position, putting them into a higher position with title and some more money does not give them necessarily the power to make the actual decisions that need to be made and actually run the organization. It's in name only.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have to be careful.
It's important for us to understand what decisions we have authority to make in that interviewing process as we move up, and really, really be clear about that. But I do want to, because I don't want this to turn into I want this to be productive. We got some pretty cool people on here, and I think this has been amazing. So I'm not saying it's not productive. But what I have experienced, and I'm sure that both of you have too, is that a lot of our clients are sincerely wanting to make change in their organizations. When they reach out, when they finally get to a place where they reach out and they talk to a consultant, and they hire a consultant, especially if they hire at my rate, they definitely want to do something. They do want to make change. I just think that change isn't easy. And this is where we all have to really get involved, and why it's so important to make sure that the people that are in these roles, Dr. Baker and Daryl, you and I talk about this all the time, have more than just lived experiences.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They have to know this work in order to be able to help an organization create an allyship culture or create a program for sponsorship. You got to be able to see this even in a 360, right? You have to be able to help and shepherd your clients in these organizations and your colleagues through this change. And so I talked earlier about the backlash a few years ago. Now we're also getting in this space again, where white men are saying, wait a minute, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't seem right. There's this conversation about reverse racism,
Right.
because there's a misunderstanding of the definition of what racism is, what it looks like, and how it plays out in our culture in the US and abroad, right? In other places. Classism is part of that as well. And so I think we have to, as consultants, and even those on the phone who are not in your organizations, have to hold and be responsible and hold others responsible. Because at the top, typically those decisions are being made for a variety of reasons, right? It is, we want a better culture. We do recognize that there is a disproportionate number, there is a disproportionate number of people in leadership in the organization that are not heterosexual white men. We also recognize that we can be more profitable with a diverse workforce. So they have all of that. They understand it. They bring in consultants. They're the first people typically who are trained on the value of this. It's about when it starts to move down past that EVP level, right? It's those vice presidents, those managers, those directors and senior managers, where we seem to have an issue with allyship and sponsorship and all things related to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because we put so much pressure on them to perform. They say, you know what, if it's about meeting the numbers and meeting my goals, I'm just going to do it the way I've been doing it, because that seems to work. And that's where all the affinity bias starts to work its way in. And so I hope I'm not taking this conversation in a different direction, but what my goal into sharing that is there has to be so much more accountability in our organizations around building a framework where allyship and sponsorship is seen as valuable and necessary in order for our organizations to expand, and that everybody wins when more people are involved in the process. So, and then my last thing I'm gonna say is the people who need to be creating more allyship are the people who are different than the majority. Because if we can bring ourselves together and support and move the needle, all women, intersectionality of all women who identify as women, people of color across all intersectionalities, that also does help move. And so if we're all moving from the bottom, top, the side, the middle, then we'll get there. If we don't, there's going to be these sanctions and everybody's still fighting for the one thing that's important to them.
So this has been an awesome discussion, and I will tell you, I had my list of questions, but you touched on every piece that I wanted to talk about. I have one, I think we have one question in queue. Carla, do we have some questions that people have asked that we want to address?
Yes, we do have one question from Jen. It's somewhat a loaded question. Here goes. What is the best way to diffuse a situation where a white coworker attacks a Black, POC, or Indigenous person? A situation one-on-one, not in front of a group.
Do either of you want to take that?
Oh my goodness.
That would never happen to me. So let me think.
But it that happens all the time.
All the time.
And I kind of want to ask, what type of attack? What are we talking about in terms of attack? Because I think, there are microaggressions. That's an attack. There are very overt types of discriminatory acts or messages. that's an attack. And I think part of what we have not done in the DEI space is we equipped organizations with how to infuse DEI in the fabric of the organization. We don't teach people who are marginalized and disenfranchised and oppressed how to respond.
How to respond.
Amen.
And I think that's a gap that we have.
Yeah. So I'll go first. I think, to your point, Darylyn, there is no perfect answer for this. But what I know for sure about human behavior is that it is best to de-escalate and to walk away. And the reason I say that is because stories are told and you're never there to defend or be able to share your side of the story. And I have seen in all sorts of sizes of organizations, and she said, and Janine said, or this person said, Jerry said, Holly said, Dee said, like I've seen that play out, and without any sort of outreach to the person, it's believed. So I always believe in de-escalation. Like, okay, I see that you are upset and I feel like this is not the right time or the right place to have this conversation. And even going a step further, I don't feel comfortable having this with you without witnesses. Sometimes if you let someone know how you feel, what's going on, even if they are angry, even if you feel like you are under attack, it typically brings it down and it can end it. I think the best thing for us to do is to always end it and come back to it when we feel like, okay, we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it with someone else here. I don't advise anyone to have heated debates in private, at work, with anyone. That's just my position.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is an entire class in conflict resolution, and really would have to understand the totality of the situation. And thank you, Carla, for putting it in there, and Jen for bringing this up. But somebody being attacked in the bathroom, I try to keep it simple, stupid, right? Really try to, the stop, drop, and roll technique. Just keep it really simple. And what I tell my kids, stopping is okay to tell somebody to stop. Mm-hmm. Number one is to stop whatever that inappropriate behavior is, to stop. And I come from a place where we have to determine at that particular time and place what type of stop message that looks like. Mm-hmm. Is it loud and boisterous? Is it quiet? Hey, is it, hey, let me grab your hand a little bit and kind of stop, or you may be going too far? We have to take that in consideration. But stopping the abuse is paramount, is what we can do to stop the abuse. And secondly, I would say after we've stopped it, is to offer the opportunity. We have to get in our de-escalation phase of the conflict resolution. Stopping, de-escalate the situation, separate. And if you wish to have a conversation, but behaviors that are inappropriate should be dealt with. They should not be swept under the rug.
Yeah.
At whatever level it needs to be dealt with, it needs to be dealt with. And as much as we think that it may not happen again, and the person may not, they were on something, it needs to be reported to the proper being. Now,
absolutely.
The only problem with reporting it is that we have HR who's in charge of hearing employee complaints, but not necessarily trained in investigation and resolution.
Yeah. And
they always take the side of the company versus the actual employee's situation, right? They want to err on the side of company and being protected by the insurance and so on and so forth. That's why we have employment discrimination cases. But it needs to be reported. And then you have the opportunity to give your own opinion about it as well. It's like, hey, this is making me feel uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Regardless of whether you're right or wrong, it's making me feel uncomfortable. And I don't wish to be around somebody or being part of this. And I need to take my own action. So not only is it a complaint from the person who was abused as the original victim, but you're also a victim of this as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Say
And it's
something.
important.
And just
it's
always remember human behavior, people attack people who they feel are, less powerful than them. And it sounds like it's probably some like the dynamic in the ladies' room, right? All of those sorts of things. Someone was sought out. That's a real predatory behavior. And so I think it's really important for us as individuals, people of color, women, people who identify as women, whoever, wherever you show up. I think this is the education piece, Darylyn, that you talk about all the time. We need to understand human behavior.
Yes.
At all, in every aspect. And I think, and that comes with time, right? Understanding how people show up. But I always say, do not stay or work in an environment where you're being abused and your well-being is being threatened. And no one is there to come to your defense or your rescue. And if the organization is not set up to do that and they reward bad actors because they're high performers, then that tells you the environment that you are in.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes we see where we work and we continue to stay there for whatever reason. And I hope that that reason does not cause you to, people are being broken in these organizations because there are no allies there. There are no sponsors there in general. And bad actors are being rewarded, and we don't want to stay there. We don't want to have anyone be in an environment that's like that.
Right.
Absolutely. And I'm going to wrap this up because we're actually 6 minutes over, but it's okay.
I'm so sorry. I didn't realize.
No. Let me tell you, people stay on because it's good discussion. It's good discussion and it's information they want to hear. The one thing that I will say about that situation, I do agree with both of you. I know that I have been taught that, when people come at you and their energy and level is high, the worst thing to do is to match their energy because it doesn't de-escalate anything. It takes it to a higher level. So I think it's important for us to know that, but we have to also hold the organization accountable for making sure that we're protected. So that is an important part. When Dr. Baker said it has to be reported, it does have to be reported. And then Janine said the other piece that I think is extremely important. If your organization doesn't protect you, are you at the right organization? We have to think about that. Okay, so we're done for today. I want to first thank Janine and Dr. Baker for joining us today. This was great, and I will have both of you back on because there's a lot for us to discuss. We have these discussions once a month where we talk about some aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we need to know what you in the audience want us to talk about. We come up with subjects that we know are important based on what we hear, but you all are the ones, and some of you all join us every month. I want to know what you want us to talk about. Now we're taking a break in December because we just need to take a break. It's the end of the year. We have other things to do, but we will definitely be back in January. And I think in January, it might be me and Janine coming back talking about leading DEI efforts in your organization and the organizational maturity of DEI. So we'll be back in January to talk about that. But as we wrap things up, I want to give a couple of reminders. First, if you want to engage with us, make sure that you connect with us through our LinkedIn profiles. So you have our email addresses and our LinkedIn profiles on the screen. Make sure you connect with us. Okay, because we're about to end, but don't forget to join us in January because we've got some exciting news to share with you in January. And we thank you for joining us today.